Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is William Jenkins, and I am the director of the City Institute at York University in Toronto, Canada. Our institute was established in 2006 as an organized research unit at the university, and we are a community of affiliated professors, graduate students, senior undergraduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and visiting scholars who all share an interest in collaborative, interdisciplinary, and critical urban research. Despite the realities of COVID-19, we are carrying on with our research as best we can, operating in a virtual capacity as with the rest of the university. Our researchers are engaged in funded projects that examine issues of urbanization and gender in the global south, also issues of suburbanization and housing in Canada and in other parts of the world, the phenomenon of the smart city, and of course, research on several themes affecting the Toronto region. And speaking of the regional context, and although we are not gathered in the same location right now, I'd like to acknowledge that many Indigenous nations in this part of Canada have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, and that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm also pleased to acknowledge that the book we are launching this evening, In the Suburbs of History, Modernist Visions of the Global Periphery by Stephen Logan, is part of a series entitled Global Suburbanisms, published by the University of Toronto Press. As you can see, one of our co-sponsors this evening is the Global Suburbanisms Project, a major collaborative research initiative that was housed at the City Institute and led by the Institute's first director and this evening's moderator, Professor Roger Keil, who will introduce the author and panelists shortly. Professor Keil is a member of the newly minted Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. And in addition to having led the Global Suburbanisms Project, he is currently working at the intersection of global urbanization and infectious disease. He is also the editor of the Global Suburbanisms series with the U of T Press, which has published 8 volumes to date, including this evening's work. I'd like to finish by offering my congratulations to Dr. Logan on what is a very well illustrated, as well as inspiring and informative investigation of the post-war suburbs and outskirts of Toronto and Prague in the post-World War II period. I'd also like to let everybody know that this virtual event is being recorded and will be publicly disseminated on the City Institute's YouTube channel. And with all that said, I'll hand you over now to Professor Keil.
Thanks very much, Willie, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's good to be back at City, if only in virtual form. I only have a few opening remarks before we get the show on the way. I'm extremely pleased to have been asked to be the moderator tonight. It's a really wonderful event for us, from speaking from the Global Suburbanisms point of view, of which I was the principal investigator for about 10 years, and we have closed down the project a year ago, a little more than a year ago, but we've been going strong. One of the outcomes of our work will be feted and celebrated tonight on a panel. This is, I believe, our first virtual book launch in our series, and I'll speak to that in a second. The project was at York University for about 10 years, but it involved 50 people around the world, and I've seen at least one of our members from South Africa on the list of participants. Alan, I'm glad you're still up and awake, and I'm really happy to see that the community that we created continues to be there around the globe to support each other. We've done a lot of things together and have traveled together in many workshops, joint events, and have done a lot of research together. And I think we created a network of suburban research, which actually will survive the actual project, the funded project. And one of the ways in which it will survive is through the book series, which is going strong. We have declared at some point that this is the age of the urban periphery. And this is for Murat, who I know is also listening in, of course, Istanbul, and that's the new periphery that we see in many parts of the world today, particularly in cities of the global East and the global South. But this doesn't look all so different from today's Mississauga either. Before we got to that, which is really the 21st century urbanism, we've had a history of suburbanization, and that is really where we're turning our attention to today. And for that history, the 20th century there was a suburbanization in the 19th century, but today we're talking about modern suburbanization in the 20th century. And before that, of course, we've had these archetypes that we here in Toronto know all too well. I don't have pictures of North York. I live closer to Scarborough and I have my camera always with me. So this is Scarborough, but this is also Scarborough. So these are the two prototypes. And in the global East, before the fall of the wall in the socialist countries, we've had similar prototypes. And we had this, which again is not in the Czech or in the old Czechoslovakia, where this would have been, this kind of urbanism would have been built, but in Tallinn, in Estonia. And so is this kind of urbanism, which now also exists around the cities of the former East Bloc, as they were called. And today's book that we're going to talk about, of course, deals with the prehistory or the modern history of what we find today in the peripheries of Eastern and Western cities alike. This is the latest, not the last, the latest publication in our book series, which you see displayed on this slide. It's quite a beautiful series of studies. Most of them were edited collections, some of them thematic, some of them regional. And it is a distinction of Stephen Logan's book that we're launching tonight, that it's the first monograph in the series, but it's not the last monograph. There are at least 3 more monographs in the works right now that will add to the series, about 5 or 6 books at various stages of completion. So the series is going strong, and I'm encouraging everyone who's listening, who is doing research in this field of peripheral urbanization, suburbanization, and so on, to please send us a proposal. So we're starting with the actual event. The author of the book tonight, who will be speaking last, is Dr. Stephen Logan. He's an adjunct faculty and 2021-22 postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Communication, Culture, and Information Technology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. His most recent article, The Suburban Fix, explores the social and political implications of infrastructure innovation and the techno-utopian promises of self-driving cars to save the suburb. This has already created quite a stir, this article, in social media. It's been very well received. His work on suburbs and automobility reaches back to his days in Prague as a co-editor of Carbusters magazine, to his work on the 2009 site-specific Leona Drive projects in Willowdale, and his recent contribution to the edited collection Massive Suburbanization, which is also a volume in the Global Suburbanisms project. We are joined, or Stephen is joined on stage, so to speak, by 2 really distinguished critics, and I call them critics because both of them have a history of being architecture critics, and they know the subject matter of tonight's event really, really well. One of them is local here, very well known to all of us here in Toronto, influential journalist Alex Bosikovic, who is the Global Mail's architecture critic. He's the co-author of Architecture, a City Guide, a wonderful book. And he has won the National Magazine Award, and has also written for design publications such as Azure, Blueprint, Dwell, Spacing, and Wallpaper. And the other book that I featured here, which he is a co-author of, has recently been quite important in the conversations in Toronto of how to deal with a yellow belt. I guess that's why the jacket is yellow. And I assume that some of the topics raised in that book might come up in our conversation tonight. But before we get to Alex, we will turn to Amanda Kolson Hurley, who I met in a small coffee shop in, I think in Markham, when we toured the Toronto suburbs together, and we had known of each other from Twitter, and she wrote a quite wonderful piece at the time. Amanda is a journalist and author with a long experience covering architecture and urban planning, policy, and politics. Currently, she's an editor at the magazine Bloomberg Business Week, and previously worked at City Lab. And before that, as a freelance contributing to publications, including the Washington Post and the Atlantic, her book, I would say her indispensable book, if you are in our line of work, Radical Suburbs on Experimental Suburban Communities, came out in 2019. It's never far from my desk. It's always a source of inspiration. Amanda has a PhD in literature from the University of Bristol and an MA from the University of St. Andrews in the UK, and lives in Silver Spring, Maryland, from where she joins us tonight. Amanda, please start the conversation. Thank you very much. I'll come back in later.
Hi, thank you for that very generous introduction, Roger. I'm so happy to be here tonight for this book launch. If there's an ideal reader for Stephen's book, I think I've got to be it. I really enjoyed the book and found so many resonances with my own work on suburbs, or suburbanity, I guess you could call it. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about my own work on the suburbs and some of those links that I saw to Stephen's work, particularly focusing on two communities that I write about in my book. If I'm going to need some help loading the slides remotely here. Great, thank you. So, when I was reading in the Suburbs of History, one of the places that came to mind a lot at various points was a suburb that's not too far from where I live in Maryland, close to Washington, D.C., and that is Greenbelt, Maryland. It's a fascinating place. This is an aerial view of it from the 1930s. Greenbelt was built by the administration of FDR as a New Deal project, and it was really intended as a model community for the entire nation to hopefully follow. It was part of a program called the Greenbelt Towns that was heavily inspired by Garden City planning concepts. And the original ambition was that this would be a program that would build, hundreds of garden cities, on the peripheries of major cities across the United States. That ambition got scaled back to, I think, 25, and then eventually 4, and then the 4th one wasn't built. So there were ultimately only 3 of these demonstration projects, but they were quite influential and really quite a radical departure from the sort of archetypal suburb, that we think of in North America, defined by, lots of single family homes, separation of uses, the domination of the automobile, stratification, by income level. So Greenbelt was an attempt to shake all of that up. And you can see in this aerial view, it was planned as a sort of half moon or crescent. Actually, a lake was dug nearby first. You can see the lake there. And off in the kind of bottom right, you can see that it wasn't just housing. There was a small town center there with stores, with a movie theater, and a little bit up from that across the parking area, a school that children could all walk to on a dedicated set of pedestrian paths. So there was an attempt at a complete community of the type that Ebenezer Howard, advocated, not just a kind of dormitory suburb. Next slide. Oh, yeah, here we are. So Greenbelt was different from the conventional suburb in many respects. One of them was that it was higher density and it had a mix of different housing types. So these are some early residents relaxing on a shared green plaza outside of a multi-story apartment building. You can see the architecture was some pretty modern in style, kind of inspired by the Bauhaus. There were also row houses too, but there weren't any, well, I guess there were just a very, very small number of actual detached houses. The idea was that you could have a suburban community and give people access to a lot of green space and have that kind of suburban feel, but without the reliance on the single family home. Let's see, next slide. Thank you. And this is a photo here of the public swimming pool at Greenbelt, which was quite unusual at the time. There were very few public swimming facilities. The idea from the outset was that this, as I said, would be a complete community. They would build the stores and the schools and the kind of services and amenities up front. And so that people would not be moving into to just a house or just an apartment building, that it would really be a community from the start. You can see some of the apartment buildings arrayed on the crest of that slope behind the pool, as well as some of the row houses. So one of the fascinating things about Greenbelt is that the people in these homes did not own them. This was a rental community. The federal government of the United States was the landlord, and as it was a demonstration project. And so people applied to rent a dwelling. It was very competitive. And the people who were accepted then paid their rent to the federal government. This is extremely unusual under a United States paradigm. The federal government is really no longer involved, in the direct management of housing. And ultimately, this model got into legal trouble in the courts, was kind of, the federal government's jurisdiction to do this was struck down, which is one reason that there have been no greenbelts after the 1930s. But for a period there, it was pretty fascinating that I think you really saw that with the success of Greenbelt that a successful suburban community where people feel a sense of civic spirit, is not, that can be achieved without homeownership, which is so often held up as an ideal or as the bedrock of the suburban community. Greenbelt did just fine without it. Sorry, next slide, please. So this is a more contemporary shot of Greenbelt, actually taken by a photographer who published a wonderful book focusing on these New Deal towns. It's called New Deal Utopias. His name is Jason Reblando, and I'll just plug that. It's kind of a coffee table book, but they're really fantastic photos of these very kind of singular places built during a unique moment in American history. This is one of those shared spaces in Greenbelt today. You can see there's a play area for children, but this is also where paths converge in quite a lovely way, in the stand of trees. One of the focuses in the design of Greenbelt was the separation of pedestrians from cars. The planners of Greenbelt were, as many planners at the time were, very concerned about how to kind of accommodate and tame the automobile. They realized that they would have to make concessions for it, but they wanted to keep pedestrians safe from these big hunks of metal. And they thought the way to do that was through a pretty elaborate system of pedestrian circulation, including underpasses under the major roads of the development. And today, a lot of residents enjoy, going on daily walks, walking their dogs along these pathways. But I kept thinking about them when reading Stephen's book, because that is something that kind of keeps recurring throughout the book, was the same question, I think, that really taxed the planners of Willowdale and also of South City in what is now the Czech Republic. How do you make this work when you have these very different needs of the driver and of the pedestrian, and how do you kind of keep them separate? Obviously, that paradigm of separation has come under scrutiny and come in for criticism in recent years. But I kept thinking about how it was a very difficult challenge, I think, for them, and I think they devoted a lot of time and ingenuity and care in trying to reconcile these competing needs. I think also what this photo of Greenbelt shows is as well just the importance given in the design to green space, to people having access to the open air and to greenery. That's also something that really resonated with me in Stephen's book, is just how that was really a top priority for the planners of these communities, both in Canada and in the former Czechoslovakia, and that recognition that people really need that access, whether it's quickly departing for the countryside or having those spaces kind of woven in closer to their actual dwellings. Next slide. So the second community that Stephen's book really put me in mind of is another one not too far from where I live. This is Reston, Virginia. It was a 1960s suburban experiment. And Reston actually makes a couple of cameos in the book, I noticed. Probably described more accurately as a new town than a garden city, but certainly in that same lineage of ideas about kind of reformist suburban planning. I love this photo. I think it captures so much of the kind of idealism of the first days of Reston. And as you can see as well from the architecture, it was quite an unusual place at the time. It got a lot of press, including when it was first built, including a pretty glowing write-up by Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic. Reston was built by a man named Robert Simon, who was from a sort of real estate development family in New York. He had lived in the suburbs as a young man with a family and found it pretty lacking in interest and variety. And he had also spent time as a young man touring Italy, riding a bicycle around the hill towns of Italy. and thought, you know, this was the type of urbanism that, that America needed as it grew. And this was the type of city or town that he wanted to build, you know, to kind of counteract the wave of, you know, suburban kind of sprawl development that had, you know, really been unleashed on the country after World War II. So Reston was kind of conceived as an anti-suburb, you know, really a rebuke to the Levittown suburbs that were proliferating at the time. As you can see, there's quite a tall building. This was a 15 or 16 story apartment tower in the background there. Robert Simon, the founder of the town, actually lived in the on the top floor until his death a few years ago at the age of, gosh, I want to say 100 or 101. And then there are also kind of townhouses and apartments around this man-made lake. This part of Reston called Lake Anne was the first phase of the community built. And the idea was to achieve a sort of modernized version of the Italian hill town and to really mix everything up. So the separation of uses was really challenged. This same lakefront area, or kind of area hugging this lake, had a church. It had a plaza with a number of shops, apartments over those shops. I think at one point it had a community center. You could rent, you still can rent boats and go kind of paddling around the lake. There's a fountain in the plaza. So it was a very, very lively place. And that was what the goal was, that it would be mixed in income, mixed in housing type, mixed in race and ethnicity as well, which was very unusual in the South at the time. And that it would just be a lively urban type of place. Next slide. So here's another shot of that plaza at Lake Anne. You can see there's a sort of brutalist style play area, play structure. Not in this shot is another brutalist fountain that kids could also play in. But these are townhouses and apartments surrounding that plaza. And it was marketed as a place for families, really, but a place where kids could be more independent and wouldn't be kind of stuck in their, you know, in their home on their big suburban lot, but could partake of that urbanity themselves as well. Next slide. This is a photo of, I think, an early unveiling or award ceremony. It's escaping me now. In Reston, you can see that the sort of curve of the apartments that surround that plaza area. Underneath them on the ground floor are shops. But you can see the racial diversity of the attendees here. Reston was quite unusual in that because it was open, it marketed itself as an open community because housing discrimination was rife at the time, especially in the state of Virginia. Black Americans who wanted to move to a suburban location did not have a lot of options. Reston became a place that was known among Black homebuyers as a place that was receptive. And so Reston from the beginning had a fairly large Black community that was quite active as well, organizing some of its own events through an organization called Reston Black Arts. So that's quite an unusual legacy for a suburb in the American South from the 1960s. Next slide, please. So this is a trail through Reston. Reston still has a much loved set of, and quite expansive set of kind of nature amenities and recreational amenities, including this big trail network that's quite lovely. This is something in common with Greenbelt, again, is the emphasis given in, I think, in Reston's design, but also in its subsequent kind of management as a community. The interest given to the outdoors and to having nature kind of, interpenetrate, areas for commerce and for living. Nature was really seen as an open space, was really seen as fundamental to the quality of life there. And again, I saw a lot of resonances with Stephen's book, especially when he talks at the end about this big heap of the discarded earth from construction of South City that was sort of this byproduct that they just wanted to get rid of, that actually became this nature site almost by accident. I think it's very interesting the way that these planners of these different communities have tried to build in something more urban, but realize that one of the, I guess, one of the attractions of living in a suburban environment is this access to the natural world and feeling surrounded by greenery. Next slide, this is my last one. And one of the things that really struck me, thinking about Stephen's book and about the suburbs that he focused on and all the ways they're kind of in dialogue with some of the places I've written about. The similarity between these two passages really struck me. The first one is a fairly famous fulmination by Lewis Mumford on the kind of Levittown style suburbs, which he thought were an absolute, blight on the landscape. And, he talks about them basically, being these uniform houses lined up inflexibly on, in a treeless communal waste. All of these people like automatons in their house, just watching TV. There's, nothing to do. Basically, it's a prison that you can't get out of. And I thought it was very, I was reminded instantly of it reading this passage on the Panelak, I'm probably saying that wrong, housing estates by this Czech novelist, saying that, they have this poetry of boredom. People go there to sleep. They have a TV, but not much else. There's, it's a wasteland with a smattering of green. The blocks just seem to stretch on for miles, with no end in sight. Again, this idea of just this monolithic uniformity, and the suburb as just a place that you escaped from. And I thought it was so fascinating that the physical, environments that these two writers are describing, are vastly different. Obviously, they're separated by an ocean. US is very different and very distant from Czechoslovakia of the time. But these writers are describing or excoriating the suburbs in pretty similar terms. And it kind of made me wonder, if maybe this is a question that Stephen could address later, if, some of the, I guess you might call it, elite disdain for suburbia, if there are factors besides the physical environment that are animating that. I would guess, yes, there are. And, what is it that kind of animates this derision of the suburbs, even when, the actual factor, physical factors of the suburban landscape can be extremely different? Why it always seems to give rise to the same response. And is there a way past that? Is there a way past that? Perhaps it is by using some of the strategies that the planners that Stephen writes about, attempted to do, to soften those big long rows of apartment blocks, right? To add some greenery, to try to stimulate social life and collective spaces. So I think that's, I've probably gone over my time now, but those are a few of the thoughts or reasons I had to appreciate this book. And that's it from me.
Thanks so very much, Amanda, to put that into the North American context. And one is always on the defensive if one studies the suburbs. You know, always have to defend the suburbs against those kinds of conversations if one wants to defend them. I know that very well. Our next speaker is Alex Bozikovic, who I already introduced, but before we get to him, I just want to quickly do a shout out to Jody Luchak, who is the editor of this wonderful book series, who's joined us also in this conversation, and would, if you give me as the editor, the academic editor of this series, if you send me a proposal, eventually she will be involved in looking at that proposal together with my editorial board. I also see some members of the editorial board have joined us. So without further ado, Alex, please take it away. Let me say one more thing, a service announcement. If you are itching to ask a question in the audience, please, you can do that at any time in the Q&A. I will look at those, and later in the Q&A, after Alex and Stephen have spoken, I will broadcast these questions into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And thanks for your very overly kind introduction as well. It's really a pleasure to be here to celebrate this excellent new book by Stephen, and in the presence of Amanda, whose book and whose writing work I've enjoyed for years. So I decided to take a slightly different route here, to take sort of a detour away from Stephen's detours, and go a little bit deeper on one particular thing that is just touched on in the book. As Roger mentioned, I wrote or rewrote a book called Toronto Architecture, a City Guide, which is a comprehensive guidebook to Toronto, originally written in the 1980s. And when I came back at it a couple of years ago to expand it, I wound up sort of tacking on 2 new chapters for the suburbs, which were essentially everything that was built in Toronto after, or the vast majority of what was built in Toronto after 1950, which is in fact most of the region. And in there was a 2-paragraph entry I managed to get in on Flemington Park, the neighborhood which Stephen mentions as an example of the sort of apartment-style neighborhood unit in North America. So I want to just dive into that a little bit and look at a couple of things, how the architecture of that neighborhood was shaped by a couple of ideas. One, a sort of phenomenological goal, or an idea of sort of shaping a place that would be alive to the senses, as the suburbs generally were not in the eyes of its architect. And then this idea of sort of collective space, a shared quasi-public, quasi-private space that was very unusual in North America and pops up here and in a few other places of the period, and which I think might have something to teach us. So let me do my screen sharing business. Excuse me. All right. Hopefully you are seeing a slide that has the words human patterns on it. So my subject here is an architect called Irving Grossman. And he was the main architect for the buildings of this neighborhood in the post-war suburbs of Toronto, Flemington Park. He also wrote extensively for the main architecture journals in Canada at the time. He was closely associated with a couple of other architects, one of whom ran this journal. So there's a real sort of interesting textual record of his thinking and what went into shaping this neighborhood. And we see right away with this piece from 1956, a very clear resonance for what Amanda was talking about. So I'll just read a few words here. We move very quickly into talking about Italian hill towns. This is a quote. This is a picture of a hillside town in Mexico called Guanajuato, apparently. And what does he say? While it may be inadequate as housing, as a complex of pure forms bathing in sunlight, it delights the eye with as much drama and richness as a cubist painting. The same picture could be many places and many times. A medieval town in France or Italy, an ancient Greek village mounting a hillside, or even a mining community in northern Canada. It is this unself-conscious charm which is lacking in most of our cities today, cities which are growing and changing before our very eyes. So you hear there a couple of ideas. The idea that the city, as it's growing today, is missing something essential, that it is missing this unself-conscious charm. So you've got the architect here, Grossman, looking to vernacular architecture, especially, but not only medieval European vernacular architecture, and largely based on that, and on a variety of other influences, including the townscape movement in Britain, he winds up doing something like this in Fleming Park. So this is a shot from the early 1960s of one of the townhouses in this neighborhood. And you can see a few things playing out here that are very particular to this place and very unusual in a North American context. This is a group of townhouses. We'll see the plan later. That are organized in a fairly dense way, more or less twice as dense as was typical for townhouses at the time, but also organized in a sort of asymmetrical manner that protects privacy or maintains privacy at the same time. There are also, what else is going on here? Grossman would say a few years later that, quote, "The artisans are dead and the machine has not produced a reasonable substitute." So, subtle though it may be, there is an emphasis here on craft. You can see in the brickwork, and it's real brick, of these townhouses, an effort to create some level of texture or visual variety that enlivens the experience of the residents. The other big piece here, and I'm just going to interrupt myself and jump ahead 2 slides because I realize I'm doing this a little bit out of order, just to get a better sense of what the neighborhood is. It is this planned community started in 1958, mixing mid-rise and high-rise buildings with townhouses and row houses. So a real variety of typologies, to use the architecture jargon, all of them at sort of middle to high density in a park-like context. And there is throughout, this emphasis on the collective space. And for Grossman and for other architects of his generation and of his particular cohort in Toronto, there was this emphasis on these spaces as providing a kind of social interaction of the kind that Amanda mentioned in Greenbelt. This is coming in a way from Ebenezer Howard and Clarence Stein. It's coming from Vallingby in Sweden. There are a variety of sort of direct and indirect influences, going back a generation here. But again, the collective space here, I think, is sort of the most particular element of this, because it's providing something in the mind of Grossman that other dwelling forms don't provide, and that the suburbs generally don't provide. So let's go here. We're looking now at the, right in the middle of this image is this sort of a clamshell shape. And that is that set of townhouses we were just looking at that are wedge-shaped in organization. Here in this aerial photograph from a few years later, they're at the lower left of the image. And this is such a perfect encapsulation of, a certain kind of top-down planned modernist suburban community, which wasn't exactly realized as the architect intended, but you can definitely see these sort of quasi-public spaces between the buildings in the lower right corner. Up on the left is 2 office buildings under construction, and the Ontario Science Centre is just at a frame over to the left. There's industry and office headquarters sort of in the top right corner here. This is all, for those who don't know, this is on the edge of Don Mills in Toronto. And so how these sort of irregular layouts play out is based on a couple of things. Grossman was said, again, writing in 1961, he was very interested in this idea of a collective or of a neighborhood unit, and that housing could organize this in some way, and that conventional suburban development, which was overwhelmingly single family houses here as elsewhere, wasn't providing that kind of space. He wrote a whole essay on this topic called In Search of the Lost Street. And so, you can see here very clearly what this thing is trying to do by creating a sort of muse or garden space Again, similar to what a number of other architects of that generation were going after, looking at historical precedents in different places. And there's a sort of studied randomness and variety to this. Again, taken from or I think heavily influenced from the townscape movement in Britain. The other important piece of that is that what's missing from this ground plane is cars. So you can see here, this is a photo, I believe, by Balthazar Korab, who shot this development in the early 60s. These photos were published in Architect magazine. This, you've got this sort of idealized, sort of utopian quasi-public space. And again, what's missing is cars, because the cars are not here, they are down below. On top of that, underneath that sort of irregular ground plane that we're looking at here is a parking garage. So this is essentially the roof of the parking garage. And so this is, a very deliberate response to that tension that comes up numerous times in Stephen's book, and that Amanda has already mentioned, between, the car and the human, the car and the pedestrian. So even when, these communities come to be dominated by cars, or rather sort of shaped by cars, the car is inescapable, Grossman in this development tries to put them away. And in these townhouses where you have these courtyards, this is what it looks like. This is a photo I took, I think, a year ago or 2 years ago. So these remain, these are now in public ownership. These townhouses, which were built by, a private developer, a big American developer, Webb and Knapp, are now owned by the city, the social housing. And their future is actually somewhat in doubt. What's interesting is that, the success of this model, I don't think is assured. I think we're at a moment now where this idea, as much as it worked or didn't work in the first place, is widely seen as failed. The sort of Jane Jacobsian critique of undifferentiated spaces, a lack of eyes on the street, which I think, in many cases is, a valid argument, winds up making places like this, casting places like this as, inherently problematic. That's maybe even more true for another one of his projects, which is very close to the York University campus, called Edgeley Village, which was finished a little less than a decade later. There's an article from the Toronto Star in, when was this? The early 1970s. And this is sort of the essential question, where this development that mixes market condominiums and rental public housing into, again, a sort of master planned, more or less apartment scaled neighborhood, is trying to do the work of mixing people by class as well. You can see here, this is a complete community. The apartment buildings, number 5 is a big one, which is this crazy Paul Rudolphian thing. It's quite fantastic, actually. Is there on the fringe of the community, and in the middle of it, you've got these low-rise, either townhouse or low apartment buildings, which are in public housing. And again, in the center of it are these gathering places. So Grossman did a lot of thinking and writing about this question of how people should mix, or how people might be encouraged to mix in this kind of context. He wrote, and this is again going back to the early 60s, that the ideal model for this kind of community was of cells within a complex. This is inspired in part by Corbusier, but also going in some slightly different directions. Grossman writes, "It is essential that man, looking at this collection of dwellings in a neighborhood, or in a building that is, that he be able to identify himself with his unit, his family, in order that his sense of individuality is not overwhelmed by his social status. He must not feel that belonging to a group means being lost within it." So that, I mean, takes on a very obvious kind of utopian dimension in this context. And it also perhaps helps explain why the kind of development that we were just looking at in Flemington Park was not more common. Row houses and townhouses were a very marginal within the real estate market of suburban Toronto in the late 1950s and early 1960s, just as they were in most other places. And yet this was something that Grossman and again his cohort were really insisting upon and found some support for from government, including the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Sort of the idea of the neighborhood unit was, this was not a commercial, these things were not commercially motivated. You know, the idea of the building or the public space as a social condenser, you know, more or less, you know, was pursued for more or less political reasons, or let's say at least utopian reasons. And so here, again, in Edgeley, you wind up with this sort of very direct thing of bringing together deliberately middle-income people and poor people who are on social assistance. And how well this works, my understanding is that this community still works reasonably well, but the social dynamics have changed. Grossman wrote a lengthy essay about this one too, which was published in Canadian Architect magazine. You know, and he talks about consulting with a sociologist on the site planning. And there are two things that come through very clearly. One is that the mixing of market and public housing was managed very, very carefully. And the basic assumption was going to be one of class conflict. And that needed to be measured and sort of modulated by the placement of these buildings and the placement of individual homes. Excuse me as I find a text. Yeah, so he talks about splitting this up by blocks. So going back to the site plan, you've got in the middle these higher density buildings, which are market, and then to the right, the smaller ones, which are public housing. And the organizing by block rather than by mixing up individual units, he writes, the option was open for the residents to identify outwards from Edgeley if they so chose to the surrounding private neighborhoods or inwards to the rest of Edgeley. So, you know, the architecture should work to a certain degree and can work to a certain degree about bringing people together. But, you know, the basic assumption is that people may not really want to mix and should not feel that they're being forced to mix with people who are not of their class. So here's a Google Earth view of where this is today. The York University campus is just off to the right. The Black Creek Community Farm is to the north. It's just such a fascinating, weird bit of distinctly Canadian suburbia, I think. To the south is a very good elementary school that he designed, and another one by some colleagues, which is also a very high quality. So this is, I think, would largely be seen as a place that is, I mean, this is not seen as a desirable neighborhood now. One of the condos in this building was listed recently for, I believe it was the lowest price of any condo apartment that's now on the market in the city. So, you know, this is not a neighborhood that has remained prosperous. You know, whether it's actually successful or not, or what that would even mean, you know, is a really complex question. I do think, though, that this basic idea of, you know, the site plan as social condenser is one that is, you know, really in danger right now. This is another project in downtown Toronto called Alexandria Park. This was built as social housing, then became a co-op, and is now in the process of being redeveloped. So this was designed by a couple of Grossman's friends, Jerry Markson and Henry Klein and Sears, all of them Jews of the same generation, Toronto raised, experience outside of the city, very much in tune with what was happening in Britain and in Western Europe at the time. And there's a similar model at play here. But as the Torontonians will probably know, this whole thing is about to be replaced piece by piece by a new mixed income development. And one of the reasons that that's happening is that this whole idea of a complex site plan is seen as being too, it's seen as inherently dangerous, right? Similar to the discourse around public housing projects in the US, this sort of undifferentiated semi-private space, you know, is seen as a magnet for crime. It's been seen as a magnet for street drug dealing, for, you know, petty crime. People feel unsafe. But there's never been I find it interesting that everyone takes for granted at this point that this sort of plan can't be made to work, or that there are small things that can be done, with the landscape that might improve it, so that places like this, which function quite well, in London, the housing estates on which this was most closely modeled are quite successful places. But the assumption is never about the details of the design or the lack of maintenance, which is clear. The solution is that, rather than this sort of labyrinthine set of, passageways and alleys and courts, that you break the thing up into a grid of streets. And, you replace it with a new thing, which is not even particularly dense, but is, again, orthogonal, straightforward, easily legible, and where there are social spaces in this new redeveloped project, they look like social spaces with which we're familiar. There's a park in the middle, which is surrounded by streets on 3 sides. There are public streets that are clearly defined as such and are still more or less, unfortunately, ruled by the car. So, I mean, I guess, this is a situation where this kind of idea, the ideas of this generation, have been put under particular social and financial pressure. And the answer has been that has to go, that the whole thing has to go, and that it is, impossible to salvage. I wonder whether that's true. And I wonder whether moving forward, places like Flemington Park might be seen with a different lens, and whether to some degree, they might actually function once again, as they were intended to do, as places that provide a different model of social interaction and a different model of neighborhood life than we are accustomed to. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex. These were 2 great commentary with lots of experience from various parts of the world. One of them very well known to most of the people who are listening, looking at the participants. I'm now turning it to the author of the book and see what he has to say about his book, and perhaps also in response to what the 2 critics have put in front of him. Stephen Logan.
Thanks, Roger. I first want to thank William and the City Institute for hosting this event. To Hazel Dizon for preparing the invitation, which was really nice, and doing the organizational stuff. And of course, Roger for moderating. He has been a part of this project from the very beginning. And I just want to acknowledge this. If we were in person, it would be the perfect mix of people. There are friends here, family, and colleagues. And although it's super impersonal, just reading names, but it's also allows for people from kind of both near and far to come. So there's people from Vancouver, Montreal, Santa Cruz, California, New York, Georgia. Sorry, JP, I don't know what city you're in. And then Czech Republic. We have someone from the Czech Republic. So I guess there's a... So thank you all for coming. I have my glass of wine as part of this, because we would be drinking wine, I guess, if we were all in person. So let me talk about the book. This setup from Alex and Amanda was really perfect, because they have given the really context for the 2 places that the book talks about. So the book covers a lot of the general history of modernist architecture and urbanism that Amanda covered, and that Alex also spoke to in his history of Flemington Park. And, I could have shown the exact same photos as Amanda. I could have shown an artificial lake, a pathway, green spaces, all of this stuff resonates in a lot of different places. So it's a testament to the way kind of modern architecture and urbanism traveled around the world. And yeah, they were really different landscapes, but people were talking about them in the same way as Amanda spoke about. And another thing, which I'm going to show you some images of these places I was writing about in the book. Just a few images from the 2 different places I was writing about, which was a suburb of Toronto. For those of you who know Toronto, Willowdale, which is kind of the old way of talking about North York Center, which are the last 3 stops on the subway line: Shepherd, North York Center, and Finch. And then in the other place is what I call a socialist suburb, or other people call socialist suburb, on the southeast periphery, or what was once the periphery of Prague, called Jižní Město, or in its English, South City. So I'm going to show you some images of them. And I want to talk about a few of those things that both Amanda and Alex brought up. One of them about like this disdain for the suburbs and how that manifested. But also, I think what's really important in what Alex mentioned was this idea of collective shared space as being a key part of the suburbs, and something that we often won't talk about because suburbs are about privatized spaces. So a different model of neighborhood life. Okay, so let me show some images from the book. Let me talk a little bit about, I mean, the book is not only about Willowdale and South City, but it's sort of, I think, you know, in a way, Amanda sort of sets the tone for it. So I don't really I need to talk about it, but. Okay, so this was the plan for Willowdale. It was one of these kinds of demonstration projects. And for those of you who know Willowdale, this was a plan that was put forward in the 60s and was sort of marked by its kind of monumentality. And it was sort of the dream of the mayor of North York at the time, James Service. So a lot of you know Mel Assman, but you don't know James Service, who was this kind of champion of modernism and was heralding this project in Willowdale in the 1960s as being like, you know, a demonstration project for North America. So you could notice like the kind of CN Tower. This was in the mid 60s before they decided to put the CN Tower downtown. And at the top of the image, a city hall that would kind of straddle Yonge Street. It was pretty unbelievable. And then this image, which is this really like kind of memorable image, which was the way that the planners wanted to redevelop Yonge Street, which was to remove all of the pedestrians from Yonge Street. So it was, you know, it's this separation of pedestrians and cars taken to its almost brutal extreme. I mean, the planners, I mean, in the end, it never happened. People know Yonge Street, although Yonge Street is still really kind of dominated by cars. So this was kind of one of the iterations of this plan, which came from, you know, 2 really well-known architects. Well, John C. Parkin was the architect who's part of it, and then Murray Jones, an urban planner. So I talk about this project as because it was about redeveloping Willowdale, which was very much a kind of, you know, this suburb of single-family homes. And what the book, you know, tries to do, and this goes back to what Amanda was saying, is it tries to like say that this is not the only model for the suburb. Single-family homes, single-family home ownership, and I think, you know, both Alex and Amanda are talking about that. And in the book, I also do kind of detour, like the book kind of charts a lot of different places. But one of the people I go to is Humphrey Carver, who was one of Canada's foremost suburban planners. And it was this real struggle relationship with this character, because I went through his archive in the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. And he was really talking about the relic of the single family house as some kind of leftover from, you know, the British, the kind of British, more rural lifestyle, even, that like your own house on isolated property, owning your own house. And he tried to like say, we need to do it differently. And so that chapter on Humphrey Carver, I think it's really interesting because but at the same time, he loved houses. He even gave it a name. He called it house lust. He loved houses. And so the chapter on Carver really plays up this sort of tension between, like, on the one hand, suburban single family houses being the model for the suburb, but also like there has to be some alternative, something along the line of what Alex and Amanda were talking about. And so, this is just kind of what Willowdale looks like a little bit now. I mean, it's part of it is about, I show this image because it's the extremes, right? You still have the two that kind of lower density landscape with this now massive density. And you really have to be there, and you're in the space in Willowdale, and you really feel this kind of tension between like the low-rise suburbs that are outside, that are off the east and west sides of Yonge Street, and the and this kind of real big density in the middle. So the plan that you saw, I mean, this really it was a kind of utopian modernist, kind of a final utopian modernist gesture, and it didn't turn out the way, but they Willowdale still battles with this because the streetscape is still really dominated by cars. But I want to talk about South City too, because like we haven't spoken all about the socialist content. That word hasn't come up, and the socialist city, the socialist suburb is really important to South City. And one of the things where like I decided to compare these two places, partially because I grew up in Willowdale and then lived in a place very much like South City, was that both these fantastical plans for new suburbs or new cities were developed at the same time. So the plan for South City also was hatched in the 60s in this kind of liberalizing atmosphere of the Prague Spring. And they were really big plans to have a diverse kind of architectural elements in South City. And it was marked by this amazing town center that they were going to build. That was going to be on multiple levels with all sorts of amenities, and would be car-free, playing up on this, the separation of pedestrians and cars, which is a kind of theme that runs through the book. But of course, here's the, I'm glad I showed this image, because this is the discarded pile of earth that Amanda was talking about. And I kind of call this like, it's like the landscape of discarded utopia. So one architect, I interviewed the architects who were still alive, who worked on this place. And one of them said, all of those ideas were just visions. And this is where they all got discarded on this big heap. And there you see South City in the background, which looks, really uninviting and alienating. And this picture was taken in the early 80s. And sort of plays in mind this, this is what Bondi was thinking about when that quote from Bondi was thinking about these places that were really alienating. And it was partially due because of cranes. The book writes about, one of my favorite topics in the book is the Czechs have this word called crane urbanism, where the architects are really pissed off because after 68, the Russians occupied Czech, the architecture sort of scene kind of fell apart, and the cranes were really seen as taking over. In a way, for the architects, the cranes became the new architects, because the dictates of the cranes and how crane technology was used to build the places sort of dictated these really long apartments that Amanda was talking about, are in the Bondi quote, and the whole orientation of the places. So this kind of crane urbanism partially destroyed the ideas of the architects, but at the same time kind of created these sort of grand spaces. But on the other hand, like there was some tense, and I think this image, I'm glad to show this image because it speaks to Alex's point about collective shared space. This was in a little bit later development in Nizhny Město in the 80s, where they were trying to think about shared space. And they actually had a word for it. They called it the living environment. And there was a real attempt to make a distinct kind of socialist living environment, which meant you were living in a space where housing was not a commodity. And you were also living in a space where there were amenities between buildings. And so there was a lot of, there's a lot of talk now about like pedestrianization and density and living in public spaces. Well, even in this like 60s, 70s and into the 80s, the socialist sort of approach to the living environment was about like, how can we live in these spaces, not with shopping or spending money, but like creating kind of public spaces and trying to free them of cars. And this is one example of what they were, a little bit of what they were trying to do. I mean, they had really limited means, right? Because all the money was spent on the cranes. And all the energy was put into building the apartments as quickly as possible. And so the critique of the suburb, this goes back to what Amanda said, the critique of the suburb in socialism wasn't necessarily a critique of the individual houses. I mean, there was this kind of mass-produced element, but that people were, you know, were sometimes the apartments were a step up from where they were before. But a lot of the complaints, and this wasn't just an elite thing, this was in the newspapers of the time, it was a critique of the living environment, a critique of the area around it. So there was a real lively discussion happening about, well, maybe it wasn't lively, but there was a discussion happening about what to do with the spaces between buildings in the suburbs. And I really think it's worth like looking at and going back to. And, you know, there's the artificial lake, right? And South City from afar looks pretty nice. And there's some older housing there. And I guess I would just finish by saying, you know, the kind of present sort of revisiting of Utopia a little bit, like when I started doing the research for this book, a lot of Czech architecture historians and urbanists were really interested in how to rethink these spaces and revitalize them and get people in public spaces. It was going on at the same time that I was doing my research. And it was really invested in this utopian idea of like, this was about modern utopia, but there was also a socialist element to it. And a kind of, you know, the socialist creation of public space was also, you know, really important to that. And there's my final parting image of one of the long crane buildings in South City. So it's a little bit of what the book is about. But I kind of want to finish. So if we could, you know, we can talk, or if people can ask questions. I think we can actually go into a mode where everyone can turn their cameras on. So it'll be somewhat more, you know, convivial.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to all the three speakers. That's quite a rich set of interventions that we've heard. I currently don't have any questions in the Q&A, as you know, for those of you in the audience who have questions, if you would like to write them in there and we can, you know, take them from there and I can ask them in your stead. In the meantime, can I just throw it back to Alex first and then to Amanda, if there's anything that in what Stephen said that made you think, you know, jived with what you were saying earlier?
Well, I guess I wonder whether this question about pedestrianization and what it would take to what makes good space between buildings. I mean, this is very much a live question in planning and urban design right now. And I'm not convinced that, I'm a little skeptical of the planning status quo, which is to essentially try and create 19th century urban conditions, you know, in the suburbs. But given what you were just talking about, Stephen, I wonder if you have thoughts about that, about sprawl repair or the urban design changes to suburbs and the current discourse on that. You know, are people getting it right? Are there? What do you make of that conversation?
What I think is kind of interesting is how the public space discussions happen in the city versus the suburbs. So the same public spaces don't apply in the city as they do in other spaces. So we expect a certain kind of public space in the downtown, but that's not always the case on the periphery. And I think spaces have to be thought about for how the people live there. You know, it's like there's a really good feminist thinker, Dolores Hayden, who writes about this in her histories of suburbs. It's just like people, we can't always impose the city idea of public space on the periphery. And now that there are so many different ways that people are living on the periphery. But I think a lot of these successful projects that Amanda talks about, and that are, you know, in a lot of the socialist and post-socialist places, there was this attention to thinking about the public space. I mean, sometimes they were really grand gestures, right? Which you don't often have so much in this, where the privatized landscape of the capitalist suburb is this, the public space is a privatized space, a backyard, right? So I think that's a thing to consider.
Amanda.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about just looking at your slides of South City, but also thinking about part of the book about Willowdale. Have those communities or other ones you wrote about, how has the composition of households and demographics, how have they changed over time? I think you mentioned in Willowdale that they sort of didn't anticipate there'd be all these kids and where are they going to go to school? I find that interesting because in Greenbelt, those houses the dwellings were small, whether they were apartments or townhouses, but there were five-person households in them. It was, they really, it was the 30s, and they gave priority in the rental selection to young families with children. So the public spaces were, photos from them show tons of kids running around, but now the average household is, one, maybe two people. So the spaces, are just, they're used very differently. There are very few kids. I don't know. I'm just curious how that might have evolved over time. I guess less time has elapsed in South City since it was constructed, but whether there's been any type of demographic change or demographic surprises,
I can't say, currently in South City, I know it was sort of set up there for families to live. So it accommodates that. But yeah, I know in Willowdale, at least, that was not, when I was reading the kind of planning, it was, that was designed, they were imagining very small families. And now the demographics have completely changed there. And now you have things like when you walk around, at least when I was walking around, there are signs where it says on a house for sale or an apartment for sale that says it's no guarantee your kids are going to get to go to school here in this district because there's just not enough schools. And so it has a different, because it wasn't a plan, so planned as South City, right? Willowdale's a really different kind of, that way, because it wasn't a total planned neighborhood, even though there was this like monumental plan. It was utterly rejected by the people because they hated it, because it was just like they were destroying their suburban haven. And there's some, obviously that was going over decades about what to do about that.
Well, I actually think this is, sorry to jump in, but this is a really interesting and difficult problem in Toronto politics right now, in the city specifically, which is similar to things that are happening elsewhere. I mean, what you brought up, Amanda, sort of speaks to the temporality of, any sort of big planned project. It serves a population well for one generation. And then if those same people are still there in 30 years, well, you have a very different demographic picture, right? And in Toronto, what's happened is, the city has decided to, was built, largely built for the baby boom. And, as were all of its suburbs. And so the model is very clear that there's a neighborhood and it's got a school in the middle of it. And all of these neighborhoods, including, houses that look like those in Willowdale, are emptying out. And so the schools are empty and the population is much more dense in other places. So you have this huge mismatch between the infrastructure, and the ideas around which these communities were built and the actual, realities. You have huge population growth surrounded by shrinkage. Like, it's a really weird, complicated problem. And I don't know what the solution is.
Can I just speak? There's a few questions in the chat. And
I'd just like to actually encourage, and I would like to ask the questions because we're nearing almost time, and I'd like to at least acknowledge that we have the questions from the floor. And then perhaps you can wrap what you wanted to say, Stephen, and also what others wanted to say into your answer to those questions before I then turn it over to Willie, coming, I think, close to 7 o'clock as we're answering those questions. There are two very interesting questions, and one I just have to select an aspect of because there's so much of it. that would get us into another round of almost dissertation length responses, I believe. So one is, at the face of it, a simple question by my friend and colleague Gerda Weckerle, who is asking about a technical question. And I know that Stephen does have, in fact, a dissertation length answer to that. So let's not, maybe you have an image to show, but Gerda wants to know more about the crane urbanism and how cranes became the new architects. Then we have a number of comments and questions from Bojana Videkanic, and I can't entertain all of them. I want to take the first one, which is really about the political economy, and the difference between socialism and capitalism has been only mentioned, but it's absolutely the most important question that needs to be asked and discussed. And there's also a comment in something else that Bojana says down below, in another comment, which is about the livability of the socialist suburb, very much debated also in East Germany, where I've seen many of those neighborhoods. So if we could, I'd like to start with Amanda and then go to Alex and give Stephen the last word in this round. Thank you.
Oh gosh, so we've got what? The difference between the socialist and the capitalist suburb. And I'm sorry, what was the first one?
Yeah, so the first one you don't need to speak to because it's about crane urbanism. That's Stephen's turf. I'll let him talk
Stephen's
about
turf.
cranes. He likes to talk about cranes. So perhaps the difference between the socialists, and perhaps bring in some of your experience from sort of radical suburbs, and you know, how do people associate even socialism or radicalism with something that has become so vile in the eyes of many?
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, just from my own experience, I'm probably the least equipped to talk about the socialist suburb because there really have been no socialist governments in the United States. But I think Greenbelt, that first example that I talked about, was about the closest that the US has gotten to a socialist suburb. It was FDR's most left-wing policy aides who pushed the idea. And of course, the fact that it was social housing owned and managed by the federal government was just a huge thing, a huge departure from the way things are normally done in the US. I can say that you know, Greenbelt from the beginning was castigated in the right-wing press as a communist city, a red city. The government official who championed it, Rex Tugwell, was called Rex the Red in newspapers, and eventually drummed out of his job. And one reason that the project wound down early, in addition to the legal issues, was just continued attacks from really from the right wing, and especially from the construction and home building industries that felt that the government was overreaching, that this was private industry's role. That's kind of a long-winded response that doesn't really get to the meat of the question, but I would just say I was struck reading Stephen's book. I guess it's hard to say that crucial difference, but the ways that different, you know, funding mechanisms and or funding paradigms and construction methodologies kind of tended to dictate, you know, or influence the outcome of these, you know, the actual built results of these plans to such an extent under both regimes. I mean, you know, in the US, you have something like Levittown. Stephen mentions the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, and it sounds like its influence and its rules had a massive influence on how Canadian suburbia looked. And then, you know, in Czechoslovakia, then, you know, it was so much was dictated by the cranes and by government policy and timelines. So with that, that's about all I have to offer on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have a lot either. Although I guess the The Canadian the apartment suburbs of Canada are actually kind of a weird mix of the two, right? Because I mean, they were built during a period from about 1960 to the early 70s when, it was basically the market doing its thing with extensive, financial advantages conferred by government and planning that was pushing it in very specific directions. It was a very, this weird mix where, the suburbs Canadian suburbs, particularly in Toronto, but not only, were planned to, allow a certain amount of single family houses, which were, the easier thing to build, but also, a certain amount of density was mandated as well. And then the construction of these largely private sector apartment buildings, although there were also social housing, was, it was this weird sort of fusion, isn't it? Where, a lot of building is happening. It's mostly private operators are doing it, but they're not totally doing exactly what they would do free of government regulation. And the result is, I mean, for better and for worse, I said huge, a lot of housing was built. And, those apartments are incredibly important now to, to the cities that they're in. So ideologically, it's interesting.
Yeah, thanks. We will go over by a few minutes, but we'll end it, in a few minutes because we all have been listening to for 1.5 hours. I just want to acknowledge there's another question here by Lisa Logan, which is about transportation and where that goes. And since, Stephen, you've just written this paper about transportation and suburbanization, perhaps you can make a segue, that's not a pun, a segue from the cranes to what you believe is the future of mobility in the suburbs.
Okay. From the cranes to mobility. Well, I always thought that there was some comparison between cranes and cars. So thanks, Gerda, for your question. And thanks, Boyana, my colleague who worked with on the Leona Drive project and has also just published a book on socialist architecture in the former Yugoslavia. Thanks, Boyana, for your questions. And Lisa, my sister. So I think the question from Gerda about crane urbanism will very much flow. It's very much connected to Boyana's question about the specificities of socialist architecture and socialist urbanism. And now, for those of you who are interested in it, that's what I try to do in a part of the book, is to try to parse out what the differences were, because at the same time they were sharing in these interests. They were sharing an interest in modernism, but crane urbanism emerged in part. I mean, it's a term that just some Czech architect used in an interview, and then I was like, this is so great. Emerged because of the need to build apartments quickly, and it wasn't necessarily it was the fastest way. It certainly wasn't the most cost-efficient way, and it had a number of side effects on the landscape, and it required a massive change to the landscape to accommodate the crane and its tracks, because they were built on tracks. So because they were built on tracks, the architects, this is in their mind, they built these long tracks to build. So the architects would have a site plan for where they wanted the buildings all nicely arranged, different sort of building materials and different kind of ways of building. But when they built these tracks, it was the most cost efficient to just keep building, and just wherever the arm of the crane could reach, and however long the track was, to just keep building. So you ended up having these really long buildings. And in a way, I mean, the cranes becoming architects is a bit, it's a bit playful, but it really, into the architect's eye, it destroyed their ability to create capital A architecture. And so in some ways that was a tension in the socialist economy between this kind of controlled production of the apartments and then the architect's desire to create lively spaces. But it's not so clear cut of like the state demanding these buildings and then the architects kind of fighting them. It wasn't so simple. So you still, even though you had these cranes, and in the initial way that these places looked, it was like that first image I showed you, the massing of heap of land, is that it was a really desolate landscape. But these big, giant public spaces really filled with people and greenery and parks. And so, as Boyana said in a later question, there was a really lively community in these blocks. I mean, not just because of the public space, but also because everybody lived there. There was nowhere else to live. And so you had, as Boyana says in her question, a kind of class diversity, and it was also in check, of different people living in these blocks, and also, children able to play in these spaces without fear of cars. And so I do think the socialist question of socialist economy is connected to this tension in a way. I mean, that's how I play it out in the book. Partially is the tension between the architects and the cranes as a way. And, and I think because these spaces were, I'm not saying the socialist suburb is the answer to the future of the suburb and the problems, but there was a real attempt to say, let's create these communities which were where you could walk to get your food. There would be small shops, theoretically. You had access to public transit. It wasn't always subway. It could be light rail. This is in the 60s. And you had a space there that was a kind of self-sustaining community in a way. And I think when in the article I write about the suburban fix, is that we always feel like technology can solve our problems, and that, well, if we have a new transport technology, we'll have a new kind of suburb. But all these older places, and I include the socialist places as well, show that that mobility is not always just about it's not that the technology doesn't determine the landscape. The technology doesn't determine how things look. And if it's kind of treated more holistically, and the car is sort of, the technology of the car is not seen as the kind of solution, then you may have the public realm of the suburbs, it depends not just on the mode of mobility, but it depends on the whole arrangement, and it depends on this commitment. And I think it goes back to what both Alex and Amanda were saying. It goes back to a commitment to collective shared public spaces where people have access to green space, even if they're in a smaller apartment. It doesn't have to be a high rise. That was the other thing about the socialist spaces. It was really this kind of diverse form of apartments that could be 3, 4, 5, 6 floors. This is really important to a healthy community, right? And I think these types of questions about collective public spaces and alternatives to the privatized experiences of the kind of, standard dominant suburb, that's where we have to move.
Thank you. Of course, I'm not going to open another can of worms here, but an interesting question for a next conversation is, of course, that a colleague in Moscow told me in the fall that in the summer, I think about 2 million people had left Moscow and only 1 million people had returned because of COVID. And we know, of course, also that in Toronto and other places, a lot of people now have moved to the suburbs. Apparently, there is a boom in the suburban real estate markets. The question then will be, if those people stay in the suburbs or in the smaller communities, how will they get around? So that's for the next conversation. I want to thank everybody for these wonderful discussion contributions to this really, really great book. Thank you, Stephen, for writing such a great book. And it is really great to have that in the series. For those of you who haven't seen this yet, there is a code, Logan 2021, which is a discount code for a purchase of this book. Now that you are in lockdown again, most of you can't go out to go shopping. Here's a good idea to spend some money. Spend some money use the discount code in the University of Toronto Press, which has supported us throughout this process. Thanks again, Jody, for this. And let me just check if I have to do anything technical before I turn it over. No, I will turn it over now to Willie, who has a few announcements, and I will switch off, and I thank everybody. Have a good night.
Well, thank you, Roger. Thanks very much to our panelists, to our moderator, of course, and to Stephen. Logan himself. I think we can all agree that this has been an intellectually invigorating and visually stimulating 80 minutes or so. And thanks also to you for your attendance and for your questions. It just remains for me to say one or two things about what's upcoming in the City Institute's calendar. On the 13th and 14th of May, the Civic Labs TO Academic Summit is happening as a virtual event. This is spearheaded by Joe Mihevich, who is a former City of Toronto councillor and presently a visiting professor with us at the City Institute. This will be a unique event in which all 8 universities and colleges in Toronto will come together with the City of Toronto to address challenges ranging from public health and transit issues through to community economies, community vulnerability, public spaces, climate change, culture and heritage issues, and also issues of technology and innovation. And on the 10th of June, we're proud to partner with the Institute for Research on Digital Learning, also at York, to launch another book entitled McLuhan's Techno-Sensorium City, Coming to Our Senses in a Programmed Environment by Jacqueline MacLeod Rogers, a professor in rhetoric, writing, and communication at the University of Winnipeg. So if the idea of Marshall McLuhan as both an activist and a speculative urbanist grabs you, please join us on the 10th of June. Last but not least, at least for now, we're also putting together a workshop style panel on the topic of edited collections in urban studies, and more details will be subsequently forthcoming about that. Information about all these events will be placed on our website, of course, and if you have any questions about them, please do email us at city@yorku.ca. Okay, that's it from us for now, and have a fantastic evening, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming, and for those of you who all stuck around to the end, thanks so much. It was good to see so many of you. Well, that's it.